Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. This week we will be discussing the foreign policy performance of the Narendra Modi government. Last month, the Narendra Modi government completed 4 years in office. So this is probably the opportune time to take a look at the failures, successes and future trajectories of the Indian foreign policy. The Modi supporters in India say that Mr. Modi's foreign policy has been a spectacular one. His critics and detractors say that it has been a complete disaster. Where lies the truth? So today we will be discussing India's foreign policy with one of India's sharpest minds on foreign policy, Mr. Manish Tiwari. Mr. Manish Tiwari is a Congress member of Parliament from Ludhiana. He's been a former union minister and he's a senior distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council in the United States. Mr. Manish Tiwari, welcome to the National Security Conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Mr. Tiwari, you said recently that the NDA government's foreign policy has been a singularly unmitigated disaster. I wonder what makes you say that. If you look at the performance of the Modi government, India gained membership of the MTCR, Australia group, the Wassenaar arrangement, all of this under the Modi government. The visibility of a rising India has become far more prominent during the Modi years. The exchange of enclaves between India and Bangladesh, the land boundary agreement. So there have been several spectacular successes under the Modi government. In fact, as many people say, he's been on 36 foreign trips and visiting 54 countries in the last 4 years. That itself is a major achievement. So why do you say that it has been a singularly unmitigated disaster?
Well, for the simple reason that Prime Minister Narendra Modi, possibly because he was Chief Minister of Gujarat for a very long time, wasn't really well acquainted in the nuances of India's foreign policy. And so therefore, on the first principles of foreign policy, which is strategic autonomy, which is India's exceptionalism, that we engage with the world on our own terms. And number three, finessing the power dynamic, the ability to be able to finesse the power dynamic, that is, maintain an equilibrium between the great powers, be it the United States, be it Russia, be it China, or be it the European Union. The Modi government tripped. And so therefore, the initial euphoria has now given way to a complete sense of foreboding. And that is reflective not only in which India's neighbors are cocking a snook at us, but the swing from the sublime to the ridiculous, that you spend 4 years debunking these principles. And finally, at the end of 4 years, when you speak at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, you really come back to those first principles and realize that you have blundered and squandered away those 4 years. And that's why we say that Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy, unfortunately, has been an unmitigated disaster.
So you're saying that there have been strategic blunders in Mr. Modi's foreign policy. Would you at least accept that there have been some tactical gains in the last 4 years?
Well, of course, in the sense that in the past 4 years, the instances which you mentioned, MCTR or the Wassenaar group, I guess there is a certain continuity in foreign policy. So therefore, if you were to rewind back to the 11th and 13th of May 1998, when Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee actually went and conducted India's second set of nuclear tests, to the conversations between Strobe Talbot and Jaswant Singh, which paved the way for a better understanding between India and the United States of America. The next steps in strategic partnership, which was conceptualized while the Vajpayee government was still in office. And then the follow-up by Dr. Manmohan Singh's government in terms of the defense framework arrangement with the US, then the Indo-US civil nuclear engagement. So therefore, if you see, and then the waiver from the NSG in 2008, which allowed the US to go ahead with that civil nuclear engagement with India. So the membership of the MCTR or the Wassenaar group are a logical continuity of a process which was set in motion 20 years back, and it has gone across administrations and dispensations. So therefore, yes, I concede that, I agree that there have been tactical gains, but on the big picture, the larger or the long view from Delhi, this government unfortunately has blundered and blundered very badly.
Mr. Tiwari, you mentioned a foreign policy consensus in India. There has traditionally been a certain amount of foreign policy consensus on crucial key issues. That seems to have disappeared. So I have two questions. One, is a foreign policy consensus a good idea in a democratic country? And two, has the foreign policy consensus disappeared because of a certain politicization of India's foreign policy, that the use of foreign policy for domestic purposes? Would you say that Narendra Modi government has used India's foreign policy for domestic political purposes, which the earlier governments may not have used?
I think you've raised a very important and a very conceptual question. Is a national consensus important, imperative, or even desirable on questions of foreign policy? And I think possibly no. That if you have a vigorous debate, even domestically, on the various options which are there as India engages the world, it is not really a bad thing. But if the consensus breaks down more on petty political considerations or partisan considerations rather than a genuine disagreement about the policy options which are available to India, then it is a tragedy. And this is what happened not with the Narendra Modi government. It happened with the BJP in 2004 when they decided to oppose and very vociferously oppose the Indo-US civil nuclear engagement, despite having put the next steps in strategic partnership into place. And what happened subsequently was a logical follow-up of that. So that consensus, because of partisan reasons, was broken by the BJP and unfortunately very senior stalwarts of the BJP. So I think the inflection point really came in 2005. And since then, we've not had genuine policy disagreements. We've had a very bitter partisan rancor on national security and foreign policy issues. And of course, there has been then the use of symbolism, especially, Pakistan being a proxy for domestic political considerations for the right wing for a very, very long time.
All right, let me ask you a different question about the politicization of India's foreign policy. It is clearly understandable and logical that in a democracy, foreign policy is debated by just about everybody. So politicization of foreign policy or democratization of foreign policy from that perspective is not a bad idea. However, in the recent past that we've seen instances where, say, the surgical strikes, the way that has been politicized for local elections, domestic elections, or the way the Prime Minister goes abroad and talks about domestic politics. Do you think that kind of politicization is negative for the sort of consensus that should exist in the country on foreign policy, or do you think that there should be absolutely no politicization at all? How do you look at the question of politicization of foreign policy?
Well, it's petty. You see, we've had disagreements in the past between principal players in the political firmament. But invariably, people would leave their differences at the shore of India. For example, if you recall, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao requested Prime Minister Vajpayee, when he was leader of the opposition, to actually lead the Indian delegation to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. So therefore, there was a certain sense of responsibility that our domestic differences should be left at the shores of India. Prime Minister Narendra Modi broke that when he went abroad, started using diaspora platforms in order to criticize his opponent, something which was completely unnecessary and uncalled for. And it was obvious that he was playing to domestic audiences. Number two, on surgical strikes, you're absolutely correct. The fact that border actions have been unfortunately conducted by both sides since 1998 is a reality. And there has been this very ghastly syndrome of beheadings which have been going on. And so therefore this tit for tat by the border action teams is a reality on the line of control and the international border. But for the first time, you saw this overt politicization after the Uri attack, whereby the Director General of Military Operations, the spokesperson of the Ministry of External Affairs, briefed in the backdrop of Indian national flags, ostensibly designed to send out a clear message of hyper-nationalism. So it was obvious that these surgical strikes or whatever happened at that point in time, because there is a general sense of disbelief with regard to the efficacy of those operations which were carried out, were not so much to change the behavior of the deep state in Pakistan or the Pakistani establishment as pandering to the crowds back home, who had promised this muscular 56-inch diplomacy. So I think that's where when you start using foreign policy engagements or even strategic or tactical operations as political props, you end up completely losing your way. And that's reflective in India's Pakistan policy. From inviting Nawaz Sharif, to switching off the foreign secretary level talks in the August of 2014 because the Pakistani foreign secretary insisted on meeting the Hurriyat, which had been happening for 15 or 20 years going back into the past.
But you have to give credit to Mr. Modi that he did reach out to Pakistan. He did give Pakistan an opportunity to negotiate with India on several questions. But it is, as you said, the deep state that may have done what it did, and therefore things went completely astray. So it is not as if he did not want to have peace with Pakistan. He did give an opportunity.
Well, in the sense, it is important to think through these issues. It is important then to understand that there are spoilers, and you will have to stay the course, notwithstanding the spoilers at play. So, for example, when the Prime Minister decided to drop in at Mr. Nawaz Sharif's granddaughter's wedding, it was a symbolic gesture, and it was a gesture of goodwill. But unfortunately, between India and Pakistan, all this at the prime ministerial level needs to be calibrated with a lot of homework. And so you dropped in at Nawaz Sharif's estate in Rawalpindi, and you got Pathankot in return. So therefore, the moment you got Pathankot in return, you still thought you would be able to ride it out. You invited the JIT, but when the JIT went and said in Pakistan, which consisted of ISI officers, that this was a false flag operation conducted by the Indian state, that was the end of your engagement. So I think what is important when you're dealing with complex and vexed questions of history, where mythology and fact intermingle, and there is this narrative between the two states, which is extremely poisonous, a narrative of partition, 4 wars, state sponsorship of terrorism, they say we interfere in Balochistan, etc., etc. At the apex level, you do not do foreign policy on the fly.
But from a long view point of view, the term that you used, it's probably a wrong thing to say that the lack of strategic thinking has come into being only in the last 4 years. There has been a consistent argument made by academics and researchers and even intellectuals in India that the Indian thinking on strategic issues or national security issues is a little weak. We haven't, for example, we don't have national security doctrines, we don't have any national security strategy. The politicians are unwilling to talk to the public on national security issues. Why don't we have a national security strategy or a doctrine clearly identifying the red lines or the do's and don'ts, what India wishes to achieve in the next 20 years, where India should be as a great power in the next 50 years. So why don't we have all of those things? So it's not, so this reacting to developments around the region and around the world in an ad hoc manner comes from that lack of a strategic vision. Would you not agree with that?
I completely and absolutely agree with you, and I think that there is a need for politicians and strategic thinkers to rise above partisan and ideological considerations. And when I say ideological, it is also because strategic thinkers come from certain classical schools of strategic thought. So you need to sort of liberate yourself from all that and arrive at a certain consensus on foreign policy. And that exercise has to be led by the National Security Advisor, the Minister of External Affairs, and the chairperson of the Standing Committee of External Affairs in Parliament. These are the three eminences who are really charged with the responsibility of building a consensus about what should be the long view from India. And therefore, in the absence of that long view, which generates at least a minimum consensus on what your imperatives in the neighborhood are, what should be your relationship with the great powers, China, Japan, Russia, United States of America, the European Union, which is a consuming market of 550 million people, there has to be a long view. Of course, there will be adjustments which will have to be made, as you go along. And the absence of that kind of a conversation, I think going back 25 or 30 years, is really hindering the kind of responses which the Indian state comes up with.
It is one thing for the governments to do that. When a political party comes to power, it probably does not have the time to do that. Why don't parties, when they are not in government, such as yourself, the Congress party, why shouldn't the Congress party come out with a certain document, a national security document, and say that this is our vision of India's future, this is our vision of national security and national strategy, and then sort of follow up some of these things when you are in power. So it's difficult for you to do that when you sort of come to office.
You see, there is a danger. It's a good idea, but there is an inherent danger in that kind of an approach. The inherent danger is when you articulate a document, it becomes a dogma. And then you get bound by it, and you have to defend the positions that you have taken in that on that particular piece of paper. I think it is far more important that you get the principal stakeholders in India's political and strategic establishment around a table, irrespective of whosoever is in government. And you see, there are certain people who have a national point of view, irrespective of whatever be their strength in parliament or otherwise. For example, the Communist parties of India. The Communist parties of India have been the most proactive insofar as the international firmament is concerned, or the international arena is concerned. So therefore, when you get people around a table and have a conversation, and out of that conversation emerges a national security strategy, I think that would be far more sustainable rather than presenting your own draft and then wanting people to either agree or disagree with it, because that basic paper, which then becomes the base of discussions, will itself get bitterly contested.
All right, let me ask you a little bit about defense reforms. One of the persistent themes in India's national security discussions is the absence of adequate defense reforms. The political class usually has no time to discuss about reforms, higher defense management, etc., etc. The armed forces are usually kept away from the higher defense management discussions. The civil servants are ill-trained to sort of deal with this. So you have a situation where you don't have a certain amount of required and necessary defense reforms in the country. I mean, I'm saying this. I'm raising these issues in the context of the recent reports concerning deficits in arms and ammunition, etc. The CAG report talked about it. So did the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Defense. So all of this, I mean, you can talk about X amount of weapons are necessary, X amount of ammunition is necessary, but I think what it at the end of the day leads to is about the question of defense reforms. Do you have a cohesive setup and framework in the country where all the stakeholders are brought together and they are able to take decisions in a sort of coherent manner?
So let me answer this question in two parts. First of all, there is a need to have not only a conversation, but you need to start implementing higher defense reforms, and already you have 3 excellent documents which are available, or which are available to every government. So you have the Kargil Review Committee, you have the group of ministers which followed up on the Kargil Review Committee, then you have the Arun Singh Committee report, and then you have the Naresh Chandra Committee report. So therefore, there is no absence, there is no dearth of material available. It is just a question of follow-up. Why is the follow-up not taking place? Because, defense reforms have to be personality driven by the Prime Minister or by the Defense Minister. If you just make an expression of intent and leave it to the bureaucracies, the MOD bureaucracy does not want the armed services to be integrated with the MOD. The bureaucracy of the services has their own imperatives of perpetuating the status quo. So therefore, there will have to be a concerted effort to break down those barriers and see that that integration takes place and jointness actually becomes a reality. Unfortunately, when you have episodes like the one pertaining to General V.K. Singh and the ostensible or the alleged movement of certain forces belonging to the First Strike Corps, I think it strikes at the heart of trust, which is imperative in civil military relations when you have to implement higher defense reforms and actually bring all this to fruition. So therefore, when you have a single episode of this sort, and given the kind of neighborhood that we have in South Asia, the hawks or the proponents of status quo, their hands get absolutely strengthened, and therefore nothing happens. And insofar as ammunition deficits are concerned, I recall when the Vice Chief had come before the Standing Committee in 2012. This is 6 years back. He had exactly said the same thing what the Vice Chief said this year when he came before the Standing Committee. So therefore, this has been an endemic problem which is not getting addressed, and it is going to create a huge national security situation one of these days. For example, if you look at the Mountain Strike Corps. Now, you've budgeted 67,000 odd crores for the Mountain Strike Corps. But if you talk to any strategic expert, he would tell you that the money which is required is far, far more. Building cantonments, building the infrastructure to look after the human resources, the schools, the hospitals and various other infrastructure which goes with it. So therefore, there is a need, top downwards, that number one, have a national security strategy. Number two, have national security doctrines. Number three, have higher defense reforms. And then only as a country would you really be equipped to deal with the kind of strategic challenges, especially, the assertiveness of China, especially in India's eminent maritime domain.
So as a former union minister and as a senior congressman, you are saying that it is time that India looked seriously at some of the recommendations given by these committees, be it the group of ministers, the Kargil Committee report, the Nareshchandra Committee, and implement those for our own good.
Oh, absolutely. You see, otherwise you will have situations whereby a little Maldives can tell you that please don't interfere into our internal affairs.
Okay, let's talk about the neighborhood policy. What is happening with India's neighborhood policy? Are we losing the neighborhood? Are we being isolated? What is wrong with Narendra Modi's neighborhood policy? Is it not a new thing, it's an old thing?
The reality, Happy Mohan, is that unfortunately we've lost the neighborhood. Pakistan we talked about, where we swung from the sublime to the ridiculous, not knowing whether we are coming or going. In the case of Nepal, for completely extraneous reasons, you blockaded Nepal because this government wanted certain things to be included in the Nepalese constitution, which the Nepalese lawmakers correctly resisted. And then you found a fig leaf in order to carry out a blockade, which has pushed Nepal, completely off the cliff. And now you have the Nepalese Prime Minister in China next week, and there's talk about all kinds of agreements which are being signed. As a result of your inability to finish the global power dynamic, you've lost Maldives to the Chinese. The one thing which was not commented upon, which went unnoticed, was the visit of General Bajwa, the Pakistani army chief, to Maldives immediately in the aftermath of when tensions between the President Nasheed and his political opponents were at a height. And now you see what is happening with Seychelles. That Seychelles has said that you cannot have a military base on Assumption Island.
So should India have intervened in Maldives? Because you written that insofar as Maldives is concerned, the Chinese are building military bases that would interdict the sea lanes of commerce from Hormuz to the Malacca.
That's right.
So our national security is at stake here. So should India have intervened in Maldives when the former president asked India to?
Well, we have intervened in the past. You see, at a point in time.
But that was a different context.
No, at a point in time when we were engaged in Sri Lanka and President Gayoom reached out to us for help, we actually sent our paratroopers, restored the government of Abdul Gayoom. So it is not that we've not intervened in the past. We intervened in Sikkim. We've intervened in Bangladesh, dismembered Pakistan into two. So therefore, there has been a litany of India's assertiveness in the neighborhood. Yes, things have changed post 1998 when South Asia became nuclearized.
So you're saying this time India should have intervened in Maldives. When you say intervened, are you talking about a military intervention? Are you talking about diplomatic intervention? What kind of intervention are you talking about?
When you use the word intervention, the rest are all tools which are at your disposal. Diplomatic, military, and other various tools which are there. You could have always calibrated it. But unfortunately, India decided to keep absolutely quiet. And so therefore, you've sent out a signal to the entire neighborhood that you can get away by cocking a snook at India. See, Sri Lanka. Today, not only Hambantota, but the kind of Chinese investments which are going into Sri Lanka, the entire waterfront of Colombo is virtually a Chinese colony. There is serious talk or serious chatter about the fact that even in the Bangladesh elections, you may have intervention and support being provided to anti-India elements by the Chinese. So therefore, the fact is that there is a 600-pound gorilla in the room called China.
How do we deal with that gorilla? What should have been India's response to CPEC and BRI? You, for example, you've commented recently that BRI is the grandest failure of Indian foreign policy. But there is also the objection regarding, say, sovereignty, or India's sovereignty with regard to the Chinese CPEC passing through POK, etc. But you also, in a different context, in the, I think, Indian Express, you wrote in May last year actually, we need to remember that China is not alone in this regard. Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan had long crossed India's sovereignty red lines when they signed the Quadrilateral Traffic and Transit Agreement in 1995. So what is your argument? Are you saying that India should have signed up to BRI, CPEC, or are you saying that we shouldn't have? And when you say that Obor is India's grandest foreign policy failure, what is your argument?
So therefore, the argument is as follows, that first of all, I don't think that we should have a conceptual difficulty with regional or transcontinental connectivity initiatives. Right. Number two, the problem with CPEC or that part of CPEC which passes through the POK is a historical problem because the Pakistanis constructed or the Pakistanis and the Chinese constructed the Karakoram highway exactly on the same salient, right? So therefore, when the highway was constructed way back in 1953, and when we took it up with the Chinese, they said that this is without prejudice to whatever is the final settlement between India and Pakistan. So therefore, that same position could have been maintained. However, if let's suppose you moved from that position and there is a surge of hyper-nationalism on all sides, you could have easily said that, all right, we have difficulty with the western part of the BRI, but we are not averse to actually looking at the eastern part of the BRI, which starts from Shui. So therefore, in Myanmar, so therefore, it could have been a far, far more nuanced position. And number three, what is the alternative that we've come out with? The fact is that
saying no to something is one thing.
Yeah, but in the sense that why have we as a country not been able to articulate a different template in terms of regional connectivity. It essentially couldn't have been, doesn't have to be physical connectivity. It could even be digital connectivity. There could be various variants of that. But the fact is that rather than some fuzzy ideas of connecting Dhaka to Karachi, etc., we've not really come out with a cohesive plan which would put India in the forefront of this regional connectivity game, at least in the context of South Asia.
Okay, let's continue with the China question a little more. The Chinese envoy recently proposed an India-Pakistan-China trilateral. The MEA has said that this is his personal opinion, and there is not too much appetite in India to go for a China-India-Pakistan trilateral. Why not? In the recent past, whenever people have proposed India-Pakistan nuclear talks, the Indians have said that, listen, there is this elephant in the room, which is China, therefore we need to bring China on board if we have to have discussions with Pakistan. You tweeted on June 12 that Trump, Kim meet any hope for India-Pakistan-China nuclear trilateral. I think that's a very encouraging position that you're taking. Can you sort of nuance?
So therefore, there are two aspects of it. One are the historical disputes between India and Pakistan, and those disputes essentially are Siachen, Sarc, Kashmir, cross-border terrorism, water, all those which are a part of the composite dialogue. I don't think that there is any room for any third-party intervention or third-party mediation insofar as this set of issues are concerned, because I think there is a consensus that this is bound by the bilateralism which came into play post the Simla Agreement of 1972. But however, the nuclear question is completely in a different basket altogether. Because if you are going to look at a denuclearized South Asia in the future, that denuclearized South Asia cannot happen without a conversation with the Chinese. So I think there is a need to draw a distinction between these two issues and say that whatever are the traditional problems or issues with Pakistan, there is no room for any third-party intervention or third-party mediation. But yes, if there is going to be a new initiative which looks at the question of the larger denuclearization of Asia, because the Chinese then will come around and say that, oh, we have concerns about the Russians, and then we have concerns even about the North Koreans, because the China unfortunately has cultivated these two rogues on its eastern and western border, and at times the chickens come home to roost. So in that larger conversation of denuclearizing Asia, I think you cannot really ignore or avoid China in that conversation.
Right. Well, last couple of questions. One is about Kulbhushan Yadav. Assuming that he's an Indian agent, I don't know whether he is or he's not. Or let's say, forget about Kulbhushan Yadav. Should India and Pakistan have an agreement on dealing with the agents working in each other's country, if there are at all any? Like during the Cold War years, the Cold War rivals did exchange agents, spies, as it were. Should India and Pakistan have that rather than hanging them, killing them, sending them to jail for 30 years?
So you raise a very, very interesting question. And this was the subject of my private member's bill on intelligence agencies, which unfortunately lapsed when I went from Parliament to government. The reality is that whenever you have an Indian national or the national of any other country operating in a third country, he is obviously in the pale of illegality. But unfortunately, in India's case, they do not even have legal cover at home. So therefore, if let's suppose there would be a legal architecture governing your intelligence services, at least you would be able to say that what this gentleman was doing or not doing in a foreign land had domestic legal sanction, and it would make for a far, far more compelling and arguable case in the international fora, rather than the guy becoming a persona non grata and completely at the mercy of the state where he is held or he's been arrested. So coming to Kulbhushan Jadhav, that irrespective of whether Kulbhushan Jadhav was working for us or he was a kind of a loan shark operator, I think it's a test case. And the Pakistanis would actually send a very positive signal if, as a goodwill gesture, they would return Kulbhushan Jadhav to us. Yes, and there needs to be a protocol, because you are absolutely correct. The issue of 54 Indian POWs who've ostensibly been languishing in Pakistani jail since 1971 still continues to hang. In 2012, there were reports that one of them was in a jail in Muscat, and subsequently, the Omanis authorities denied it when the government of India took it up. So therefore, obviously, there are all these issues, and I think from a humanitarian point of view, on people detained, on fishermen, etc., we need to have a far more robust and a far more sensitive and a humanitarian regime than we already have in place.
My last question, and it has two parts. First part is on the Sarc. Was it a mistake that India committed in not attending the Sarc summit? Sarc is probably one of those last India-centric institutions, say along with the NAM, for example. So was it a mistake not attending the Sarc summit? One. Two, how do we bring back the estranged neighbors that we have? You said that India has already lost the neighborhood. What should India do in order to bring them back? So this is a twofold question.
So therefore, on Sarc, I think any attempt or any move that we make which undermines Sarc actually is detrimental to our interests. And the reason why I say that is because South Asia is the least connected region of the world. We have the biggest challenges of poverty, of malnutrition, of unemployment, and other human developmental indices. So therefore, it is in South Asia's interest that, given the kind of intellectual capital which is available, that we cooperate with each other. We have a seamless South Asia from Myanmar all the way to the borders of Afghanistan with Iran. And anything which furthers that cause should really be supported. And the reality is that Sarc is being held hostage to the India-Pakistan estrangement. If we are able to sort out the India-Pakistan estrangement, I don't think there is any other problem with Sarc really. Sarc cannot go forward and attain its full potential till the time issues between India and Pakistan are not resolved. And number two, I think it is going to require a lot of hard work, because what has happened is that nothing remains in the vacuum. And we created a vacuum, and the Chinese have stepped into that vacuum. And so therefore, it would require some serious conversations with the Chinese on one hand. It would require certain very serious conversations with our neighbors on the other hand. And we will have to make it clear, both strategically, diplomatically, and even militarily, by developing a very robust blue water navy, that we do consider this part of South Asia to be our eminent domain, and we would take all the requisite steps necessary to ensure that this eminent domain remains the way it was between 1947 and 2014. So I think this is going to be the biggest challenge which India's foreign policy and strategic practitioners are going to face over the next one decade.
Mr. Tiwari, wonderful talking to you.
Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.